Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mysterious Headlines. This week we're going to take a look at the life and crimes of Dennis Nilsen, known as the Kindly Killer, or occasionally the Muswell Strangler. I want to caution you that in this episode I will be discussing things like sexual assault, necrophilia, and other topics which may be disturbing or triggering to some viewers. Please continue watching at your own discretion. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His mother was Scottish and his father was a Norwegian soldier. His father was not interested in his family. Dennis, his brother, and his sister were all conceived when his father was on shore leave. And then his father would go back on service and be deployed, and he would be gone for long amounts of time. He was basically not involved in his family's life at all. His father was also an abusive alcoholic who regularly beat his wife Betty. Eventually, Betty had enough. She left him, moved in with her parents, and filed for divorce. After the divorce was finalized, Dennis never saw his father again. Moving in with his grandparents was actually very good for 6-year-old Dennis. It was a more stable environment, and his grandfather Andrew took a keen interest in Dennis. Andrew Whyte was a proud, strict man who didn't tolerate any nonsense, did not drink, he didn't even listen to the radio. He was an old fisherman and would spend hours walking around the harbor with Dennis on his shoulders, telling him stories of being a fisherman and talking to him about everything. Unfortunately, on Halloween Day 1951, when Andrew was just 62 years old, he was found dead on his fishing boat, presumably of a heart attack. Because Dennis was so young, no one really explained to him what death was and that his grandfather had died and would not be coming back. Instead, Dennis's mother explained that his grandfather was sleeping, and when he was shown his grandfather in his coffin, that's what he thought his grandfather was doing, just sleeping. After months of waiting for his grandfather to come home, someone finally explained to him that his grandfather would not be coming back, and this was just traumatizing for Dennis. Dennis would later say that the image of his grandfather lying in his coffin was his most vivid memory from his childhood, and this memory and all the love associated with his grandfather clearly influenced his later crimes. In the years following his grandfather's death, he became more quiet, more withdrawn, shied away from affection, and hardly participated in family activities. He instead went to the harbor and would watch the boats for hours. He also developed a love for animals. In 1954-55, he was swimming in the harbor and nearly drowned. He believed his grandfather was just about to take him to wherever he had gone after he had died, and then somebody saved him and dragged him ashore. Shortly after this incident, his mother moved out of his grandparents' home and into her own flat. She married a man named Andrew Scott, with whom she had 4 more children. Dennis initially resented his stepfather, but eventually the two just grudgingly respected each other. Andrew Scott was really not that interested in his wife's older children and did not take Andrew Scott was not really interested in his wife's older children. He was also very strict and a very strict Catholic, but not in the same way as Dennis's grandfather had been. And this greatly impacted Dennis. As he grew up in a very strict Catholic environment, when Dennis realized he was gay in his teenage years, he was very confused, ashamed, and angry at himself. He kept his sexuality hidden from his family, but this really did impact his family. When he realized that the men he was attracted to had more feminine features, he later fondled his sister Sylvia in her sleep, thinking that would somehow correct his homosexuality. Or that how he felt about her, that he loved her as a sister, was somehow a manifestation of his sexuality, and that if he fondled her, that would somehow fix it. Obviously, this didn't change anything for him. On one occasion, he also caressed and fondled the body of his older brother as he slept. And when his brother realized what Dennis had done, he suspected that his brother might be gay and began to regularly tease him in public, calling him a hen, the Scottish dialect word for girl. As time went on, he continued to hide his sexuality and never got into a relationship with either a man or a woman in his teenage years. After high school, he also avoided relationships as much as he could. Nilsen graduated from high school in 1961. After high school, he began working at a canning factory and clearly hated it. 3 weeks after he started there, he came home and told his mother he was joining the army with the intention of becoming a cook. His first 3 years of training were spent in southern England at the Aldershot Barracks. During this time, he was unusually happy. He seemed to thrive in the very disciplined environment of the military, and he enjoyed the hard work and camaraderie of army life. He kept his sexual orientation a secret and never pursued any of the attractions he felt during this time. Instead, he focused on his training and enjoying life away from the small town he'd grown up in. During this time, he learned catering, cooking, and the art of butchery, a skill that he put to use in later years. He was also well liked among the soldiers, who introduced him to drinking, and drinking became a very heavy pastime for him. Nilsen was stationed in Berlin, Cyprus, and Aden. During this time, he started having sexual encounters with other men, including a Bavarian prostitute and a young Arab boy. While he was serving in the Middle East, his disturbing fascination with seeing himself as a corpse began to grow, and he also enjoyed the idea of having sex with somebody who was not moving, completely still, and really not involved in the act. It was during this time that the ideas of love and death began to overlap in his mind, and he took up masturbating while looking at himself in a mirror covered in talc powder to simulate having sex with a corpse. Towards the end of his army career, he was stationed in the Shetland Islands and had attained the rank of corporal. During this time, he fell in love with an 18-year-old private, but that man did not return his affections, and this just made Nilsen feel very guilty. Nilsen left the military in 1972 after 11 years of service. He left during the height of the British Army's involvement in Northern Ireland and the politics and conflict surrounding that. He was completely disillusioned with the politics and didn't want to be involved anymore. After he left, he returned to Fraserburgh and stayed with his mother and stepfather for about 5 weeks. During this time, he and his older brother had an argument over the subject of homosexuality, and whatever was said was serious enough that the two never spoke again after this argument. In December of 1972, Nilsen enrolled in the Metropolitan Police and hoped to be a police officer, recapturing some of the camaraderie, discipline, and hard work that he had experienced in the military. But he found work as a police officer very different from work in the army and very boring by comparison. He was left alone for long periods of time. He also did not have the same camaraderie with fellow police officers that he'd had with those in the military, so he was alone much of his time when he was not on the clock, and that's when he began frequenting London gay bars and frequenting the gay scene in the London area. A year later, in 1973, he came across a young gay couple having sex in a car. He was so caught off guard and felt such sympathy for them that he couldn't muster the courage to arrest them, which was required by law at the time. Instead, he resigned. After leaving the Metropolitan Police, Nilsen then began working at a job center tasked with finding unemployed laborers to fill positions. He seemed to do well in his job. He frequently worked overtime, but he was very quiet and a little standoffish, so he didn't have many friends in his office. He was known for working in the trade union movement and was eventually promoted to the position of executive officer with supervisory responsibilities. He stayed in this position until his arrest in 1983. In 1975, he met a 20-year-old man named David Gallatin being threatened outside a gay bar. Nilsen intervened in the altercation, and Gallatin eventually went home with him. The two stayed up and drank and talked. They seemed to form a friendly relationship, not really a romantic relationship. Nevertheless, they eventually bought a flat together on Melrose Avenue. The two They were together for 2 years, but the relationship was never very strong and eventually it disintegrated. And eventually, Gallatin moved out of their shared flat. For the next 18 months after the relationship ended, Nilsen dated and frequented gay bars again, occasionally finding solace in a bottle of alcohol. He had several very short lived relationships, and by the end of 1978, he was living a lonely and solitary existence. On December 30th of 1978, the loneliness overwhelmed him, and he went out to the Cricklewood Arms pub looking for companionship. There he encountered 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, who had attempted to buy alcohol. Nilsen had been drinking a lot that day and lured the young Irish boy back to his apartment with alcohol. There they drank and listened to music until they both got really tired and went to bed. At some point, Nilsen woke up, realized that the young man would eventually leave him, and decided that was not going to happen. He then put his necktie around Stephen's neck and began to strangle him. After an intense struggle, Stephen fell unconscious. When Nilsen realized he hadn't killed Stephen, but that he was just unconscious, he finished him off by drowning him in a bucket of water. He then bathed the young man, but he was too scared to do anything more, so he buried him under the floorboards of his apartment. 8 months later, he took Stephen's body out from under the floorboards, built a bonfire in his backyard, and burned most of the remains. After killing Stephen Holmes, Nilsen was too scared to do anything more, but after destroying Stephen's body, he attempted to murder again. October 11th, 1979, he attempted to murder an international student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho. After meeting Andrew at a local pub and luring him back to his flat with the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, but Ho was able to fight him off and managed to get out of the flat. He later reported the incident to the police. Nilsen was questioned, but Ho decided not to press charges. Nilsen's next victim was 23-year-old Canadian tourist Kenneth Ockenden. Nilsen met Ockenden at a pub on December 3rd, 1979, and the two talked for hours over lunch. Ockenden was visiting relatives and touring through England. Nilsen offered to give Ockenden a tour of some of the London landmarks, and they left together. After the tour, Ockenden went back to Nilsen's apartment for food and drink. After eating and drinking for a while, Ockenden was strangled while listening to music through Nilsen's headphones. After the murder, Nilsen finished listening to the record on the same headphones Ockenden had been strangled with. He then washed the body and slept with it in bed that night. Over the next several days, he kept the body in the cupboard and took it out to dress it up and sit it in a chair, talk to it, and occasionally use it as a sex toy. When the body began to smell, it was placed under the floorboards, but he took it out again several times to put it on the sofa next to him and watch TV with it. Ockenden was the only one of Nilsen's victims who was widely reported as missing, and his fingerprints were found on a London street map during a search of Nilsen's house in 1983. Victim number 3 was a troubled Birkenhead teenager named Martyn Duffy. 16-year-old Duffy had hitchhiked to London and had been sleeping on the streets for 4 days by the time he met Nilsen on May 13, 1980. Nilsen offered him a place to sleep for the night, and after he drank 2 beers at Nilsen's flat, he was strangled and drowned by Nilsen in the kitchen sink. And then Nilsen masturbated over his body and kept it in the cupboard for 2 weeks before burying it under the floorboards. On the 20th of August, 1980, Nilsen met Billy Sutherland, a father of one from Edinburgh, who occasionally worked as a prostitute at a pub near Piccadilly Circus. Sutherland reportedly followed Nilsen home after they met. At Nilsen's flat, he strangled Sutherland with his bare hands, though later said he could not remember how he killed Sutherland. Nilsen's recollections of the next 6 victims between September 1980 and April 1981 are vague and questionable. They include an emaciated Englishman in his early 20s, another Irishman in his early 20s from Belfast, an 18-year-old Scotsman, a man who may have been Filipino or Mexican, another Irishman with rough hands, a long-haired English hippie between 25 and 30 years old, and a heavily tattooed skinhead from England who had the words "cut here" tattooed around his neck. Nilsen later said that he made up the last three victims, the man from Ireland with the rough hands, the hippie, and the skinhead from England. Really, only Nilsen knew if they were real people he had killed or not. Whether or not these men existed has never been verified. His next victim, presumably victim number 11, was a man named Macolm Barlow who struggled with both mental retardation and epilepsy. He befriended Nilsen, and one day Nilsen called paramedics for Barlow after he had a seizure and fell in the street. The next day, on September 18, 1981, Barlow went back to Nilsen's flat to thank him for the help. He was invited inside and murdered by Nilsen because he had lapsed into unconsciousness after taking prescription drugs and drinking alcohol, and the fact that Nilsen didn't want to deal with the ambulance men asking silly questions. His body was stuffed in the cabinet under the kitchen sink. At this point in 1981, his flat was starting to run out of room and was overtaken by the smell of decomposition. Neighbors were complaining of the smell as well, and Nilsen sprayed twice a day to deal with the flies. So one day, Nilsen made a bonfire and burnt the remains he had. Nilsen would actually forget on occasions where body parts were, once being knocked to the floor after being hit by a pair of legs when he opened a cupboard door, so disposal of remains had become necessary. Internal organs were dropped between his fence and a wall to be eaten by rats and foxes. He boiled the skin off heads to dispose of the skulls more easily. He kept torsos in suitcases, then burned them. On one occasion, he saw a skull in the bonfire and smashed it to pieces before anyone else noticed. Other parts were burnt, buried, or kept in his shed. At some point during the bonfire, which burned all day, a group of children came and watched it from the fence. Nilsen warned them to stay back from it. When he was done with the fire, he raked the ashes into the garden. Investigators would later find over 1,000 bone fragments in this garden. A long-standing argument with the landlord led to Nilsen moving out. The landlord thought Nilsen was a problem, and the opportunity to evict him arose when Nilsen's flat was robbed and all of his possessions destroyed by the robbers. Nilsen was offered a new apartment at Cranley Gardens and £1,000 to move, which he took. Before he left, he cleaned the flat and did a final check for remains, which is when he found the hands and arms of Macolm Barlow near a bush in the garden. He got rid of them and left the flat, believing no one would ever know what he had done there. The house he moved into had been divided into 6 apartments, and his flat at 23 Cranley Gardens was in the attic. He was sure this would be a deterrent for his compulsive homicidal behavior. However, 3 more murders took place there, and his new flat presented a complicated problem regarding disposal. 6 months after moving into the new flat, in March 1982, Nilsen strangled a London petty criminal named John Howlett while he slept in Nilsen's bed. Howlett fought for his life and amazed Nilsen by coming back to life over and over again. Eventually, he drowned Howlett in the bathtub, then dismembered him. Long bones were thrown out with the trash, and portions of flesh and internal organs were flushed down the toilet. Shortly after killing Howlett, he found his next victim, 27-year-old Graham Allen, a homeless father of 1 who was strangled with a ligature while eating an omelet Nilsen had cooked for him. Nilsen then left Allen's body in the bathtub for 3 days before deciding to dismember it and dispose of it. Living in an attic flat led to Nilsen dissecting the bodies, flushing parts of them down the toilet, throwing bones out with the trash, and keeping other pieces in containers in a tea chest until he could get rid of them, though he still boiled their heads. His last victim was Stephen Sinclair, a 20-year-old Scotsman, petty criminal, and heroin addict, and also the one that brought about Nilsen's downfall. Nilsen met Sinclair on January 26, 1983, on Oxford Street and bought him a hamburger. Nilsen invited Sinclair back to his flat, where Sinclair injected heroin and drank alcohol before Nilsen strangled him with a ligature. After he dismembered Sinclair's body, Nilsen kept some parts in the tea chest and others in a bag under the bathtub. Nilsen knew his practice of flushing boiled flesh down the toilet would eventually attract attention, and it did. During the first week of February 1983, the other tenants in the building noticed their toilets were not flushing correctly. Eventually, a plumber was called who decided that his tools would not work and that a specialist was needed. On the 8th of February 1983, a dino rod engineer named Mike Cattran came to investigate the block at 23 Cranley Gardens. When Cattran opened a drain, he found the drain was packed with a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones. He reported this to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler, who suggested that they go back to look again at first light. Before he left, Cattran discussed his findings with Nilsen and another tenant. When Cattran told them that the blockage looked like human flesh, Nilsen replied that it looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. The next morning, Cattran and Wheeler returned but noticed that the drain cover was in a different position and that the apparent flesh was gone, all except a small portion and a few bones. Unbeknownst to Cattran and Wheeler, Nilsen returned at midnight to remove the particles of flesh and dump them over the fence. He thought about replacing them with pieces of chicken from the store, then decided that wouldn't work. Then he pondered suicide. Instead, he sat alone in his flat and drank, surrounded by the body parts of 3 men. Cattran then called police, and by 3:30 p.m., Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. had confirmed that the remains were human and returned to 23 Cranley Gardens. When they met Nilsen, they asked to investigate his apartment, believing that the remains had come from his floor. Nilsen pretended to be shocked about this, saying, "Good grief, how awful." In response, Jay replied, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen responded calmly, admitting that the remainder of the body could be found in 2 plastic bags in a nearby wardrobe, from which DCI-J and his colleagues noted the overpowering smell of decomposition. The officers did not open the cupboard, but asked Nilsen whether there were any other body parts around, to which Nilsen replied, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." He was then arrested and read his rights on suspicion of murder before being taken to Hornsey Police Station. As he was escorted to the police station, Nilsen was asked whether the remains in his flat belonged to one person or 2. Staring out of the police car window, he replied, 15 or 16 since 1978. Police began formal interviews with Nilsen on February 10th. Nilsen talked almost obsessively to police about his crimes, and the British press had a field day with it, especially after learning Nilsen was a qualified butcher and an ex-policeman. Cattran had contacted the Daily Mirror on the 10th of February and informed them of the ongoing search for human remains at Cranley Gardens, leading that newspaper to break the story and spark national media interest. Nilsen himself was cooperative with police, detailing exactly what to look for and where to look for it. The subsequent search led to one of the most painstaking archaeological excavations for human remains ever recorded. In total, police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions over the following days, in interviews which totaled over 30 hours. During these interviews, Nilsen confessed to and detailed his murders, though later he said he made some of them up. During these searches, police found a lower section of a torso and 2 legs in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, another section of a torso, and various bones in the tea chest. That same day, Nilsen accompanied police to Melrose Avenue, where he showed them the 3 locations in the rear garden where he had burned the remains of his victims. When asked his motives for the murders, Nilsen was adamant he was uncertain as to why he had done it, simply saying, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." He detailed that most of his victims had died by strangulation, although he had drowned some, and that when he was done killing them, he would bathe their bodies, shave them, dress them in socks and underwear, and would either spend time with their bodies, sit with their bodies, cuddle with their bodies, and occasionally masturbate next to their bodies, over the bodies, or would use the bodies in intercrural sex. But he repeatedly stressed to investigators he had never actually penetrated his victims' bodies, explaining that his victims were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. Nilsen's trial began on the 24th of October, 1983. His confessions to the police verified that he had killed his victims. The only question was whether to find him guilty of murder or manslaughter due to diminished capacity to understand what he had done was criminal and if he had premeditated his actions. Nilsen himself never took the stand, but tried to explain the roots of his destructive binges, as he called them, in letters to police that were read at trial. He wrote, "It would be better if my reason for killing could be clearly defined, i.e., robbery, jealousy, hate, revenge, sex, bloodlust, or sadism. But it is none of these." At his trial, prosecutors described him as a cunning and resourceful murderer who had killed for pleasure. Several surviving victims gave testimonies describing Nilsen's actions and his attempts to murder them. These victims included Douglas Stewart, who fell asleep at Nilsen's apartment in August of 1980 and woke up to Nilsen strangling him. He fought Nilsen off and reported the incident to the police, but the police believed this was nothing more than a lover's quarrel and never followed up. If they had followed up, it's possible that 4 more men would not have been murdered. Another victim of Nilsen's who survived was Paul Nobbs, who went home with him in November 1981. And they drank together for a while, then they went to bed, and Nobbs woke up at 2:30 in the morning with a terrible headache. He woke up again at 6 and went into the kitchen. In the mirror there, he saw a deep red mark across his throat. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot and his face looked bruised. Nilsen commented that he looked awful and advised him to see a doctor. That day, Nobbs visited the university infirmary and learned that the bruises on his neck indicated someone had tried to strangle him. He decided not to report the incident. Nilsen's defense team never denied that these events took place, but they provided 2 psychiatrists who argued that Nilsen was not really aware of the seriousness or criminality of his actions due to some unknown personality disorder. A psychiatrist for the prosecution, Paul Bowden, refuted their arguments after interviewing Nilsen 16 times, totaling over 14 hours. The psychiatrist concluded that Nilsen was aware of what he was doing, that it was wrong, and was able to form relationships, but chose instead to turn his victims into objects for his personal use. The trial ended on November 3, 1983, and the next day, Nilsen was convicted of 6 murders and 2 charges of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He was imprisoned at HMP Wormwood Scrubs. In 1994, his sentence was converted to life imprisonment with no chance of parole. In 2003, he was transferred to HMP Full Sutton, where he stayed until he died on the 12th of May, 2018, of a pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. Nilsen's life and crimes have been the subject of several TV shows, documentaries, podcasts, and a movie. He was interviewed by Great Crimes and Trials of the 20th Century in 1993. A movie was made about him in 1989 called Cold Light of Day, and a mini-series about his crimes called Des was filmed and released in 2020. This mini-series has caused the most controversy. Billy Sutherland's family says that ITV, which made the miniseries, did not care about victims or their families and just wanted to make money on other people's suffering. Nevertheless, the miniseries was well received by critics, who described it as a, quote, sensitive, finely worked drama showing the unrelentingly bleak reality of the monstrous narcissist, end quote. And that's what Nilsen is remembered as, a monstrous narcissist who killed men for his own sick pleasure. He could have had a relationship. He simply chose not to. Thank you so much for watching this video and listening to my ramblings. I really appreciate it. Please remember to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. See you next week, and remember, stay safe, don't be a headline.